Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me for Publicate 2020. I'm thrilled to say that I'm joined today by poet, academic, and co-founder of the Scottish BAME Writers Network, Jay.G.Ying. Hi, Jay. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing okay. Thanks. I'm excited to be in the festival.
We're really grateful to have you here, and yeah, thank you for coming at quite short notice. So what I want to start with is, so SBWN is just over a year old now. Are you able to talk us through, for those who don't know about your organisation, what this year has been like? What's been the journey of the organisation this year?
Yeah, definitely. So SBWN stands for the Scottish BAME Writers Network. And in a sort of short amount of time, we've had a sort of tremendous amount of, I would say, success in terms of trying to start to address some of the imbalances we see in the Scottish literary and publishing sector. To maybe give us some sort of context, I think SBWN, we started it sort of 1 to 2 years ago as a way of coming to terms with what I and myself and other friends of mine saw as a lack of organizations in Scotland which were focused on writers of colour, compared to, say, a lot of schemes, similar schemes, which were occurring in London or other parts of England, which were more prevalent. And that sort of imbalance of resources was something that we wanted to explore. And we sort of came to this conclusion that in Scotland, there were sort of maybe 3 different reasons why there weren't many opportunities. The first was that there were no writers of colour in Scotland at all, which clearly is untrue. Secondly, which is perhaps more damagingly, that even if there were writers of colour, they weren't good enough to be mainstream, or rather they can never be seen as Scottish enough to be part of our Scotland's literary landscape. And the third reason was that many people would say that actually Scotland is not racist, Scotland's not discriminatory, actually there's no barriers and we're all welcoming. And so actually there's no issues for writers. And so out of those 3 reasons, we sort of really decided that actually we needed an organization to, I guess, speak to these powerful cultural institutions and say that actually we are here, we have problems, and we need you and us to do something about it.
Mm. And so you mentioned there that you're speaking to organizations to try and address some of these imbalances. Can I ask what is it you offer to writers in the events and stuff you put on? What is it you're trying to promote amongst writers?
Yeah. So at the beginning, we really sort of led from this idea of we wanted a sort of safe space where writers of colour could gather together, could share work, could learn from each other and write. And so actually one of our foundational events was writing workshops, which we still do quite a lot of. We realized that a lot of the times writers elsewhere in the country never really make it up to Scotland. So actually our population here lose out on meeting and interacting with other writers across the country. So we have tried to bring in sort of specific masterclasses with famous writers, continue on writing workshops. And I guess we also aim to provide a resource for writers who are looking for opportunities. So we often share events, we often share competitions. Increasingly, people are reaching out to us to ask us to share things through our network, which has been brilliant and really useful. And then there's sort of things that we have plans. For example, a lot of our writers really want some sort of mentorship opportunity because that's something they rarely get here. And mentoring is so crucial for writers, for anyone in the literary industry, really. And we've been trying to focus on that. And I guess that's more towards what we offer for writers. I guess the other arm of what we do here is to liaise and speak to Scottish literary organizations in terms of sort of collaborating with them in terms of putting on maybe festivals, events, or whatnot, but also just sort of pressing them on the issues that we think are important and making sure that our voices are heard and listened to.
Mm. Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, because like I recently read through the safer spaces policy you have on your website. Is that something that, I mean, what was the process of developing that policy, and are you trying to encourage other organizations to take on similar policy, and how are you trying to do that?
Definitely. I think the safer space policy that we have, which is very thorough, it's sort of, we came to it thinking that actually this was one of the first things we needed to do as an organization. And as an organization focused on underrepresented minority people, safer space policy and having that in place was paramount, because we are aware that so many people have encountered racism, have encountered violence in the cultural sector, and that needs to be acknowledged. And so when we wrote it, we were very much thinking of making sure that we are aware of that, not only, even though our network is focused on writers of color, that the safer space policies recognizes the sort of intersectionality of these different experiences. So, we address we take a firm stance on making sure that there's no misogyny, no transphobia, no homophobia, that there's no discrimination against class, religious background, etc. And yes, I think I would like it to see organizations adopt a similar safer space policy. But I think that they need to do the work to create a safer space policy that's unique to themselves. And it's not just merely a copy paste of, say, our own policy, because actually a safer space policy allows you to reflect on your own critical shortcomings, or your sort of what you are doing right versus what you can improve on. And I realized that a lot of organizations who, for example, may not have many people on their board or staff who are minorities, well, A, first we need to change that, that's a different topic, but B, actually, they may not know where to begin. And I would suggest reaching out to maybe other sort of organizations, but realizing that if you're asking for help in crafting a safer space policy, that you're asking people to do labor, to do time. And actually, one of our bullet points in our safer space policy is recognizing that a lot of people of color often asked to do unpaid work in terms of educating others.
Are you finding that a lot? Are you finding organizations coming to you and saying, we've got all these issues, can you sort them out for us? Like, we are
starting to see that more and more, which I guess means that we are becoming more well known. So it's a bit of a sort of other side of the coin, I guess. And I think we are increasingly seeing organizations who I think maybe believe we are this sort of database of writers who we just have on a index card system, which we can just sort of trot out and say, here you go, like deal them like playing cards. But actually, our sort of aim is much more grander than that. It's a bit more sort of more abstract, I guess. So although, yes, we are seeing a lot of organizations coming to us, I think we are trying to begin to take a stance for actually, this is a lot of work for our team of 4 at the moment, who are all working part-time, who all have separate jobs and sort of roles as artists, as writers, and that we don't necessarily have the time to do a lot of this labor. And I think it's important, as organizations become more enthusiastic, that they realize that.
Yeah, and I suppose it's a case of recognizing whose responsibility it is to make these changes as well, and it's not something you can outsource.
Yeah.
So going back to the workshops you're having with writers, what's been the response you've seen so far from the people participating?
Yeah, I think the workshop and the response from people has been so overwhelmingly positive, which is great. I think people find the workshop space really valuable as a way of creating art and sharing their work, especially for writers who aren't part of, say, for example, academia or university who often find an absence of these spaces. And I think the workshops have been, we've tried to have a variety of workshops working in different genres. So on top of, say, writing prose or fiction or poetry, we have workshops based on memoir, based on making comics or zines. We have workshops which are based on different sort of themes. And I think that sort of diversity has been really appreciated by the people who go to it.
Have you managed to keep it up during lockdown?
Yeah, so lockdown has been difficult, and but actually I think we've grown used to it and actually managed to adapt quite well. Almost all of our events are now, actually all of our events are now online and plan to be until the end of the year. And I think going forward, for you and I, for people who are running these events, we can't ignore the fact that there will need to be an online component, and actually it has its own benefits. So we have been able to, for example, for one masterclass, we were able to get Mary Jean Chan, who's based in London, to sort of over Zoom hold a workshop, which probably in reality wouldn't really be able to happen. And we could also get people from other continents, for example, which none of it would be possible without online workshops.
Yeah. So at the moment, it seems like SBWN is, in terms of the people you're inviting into your network, it seems quite writer focused. Is there a kind of vision to, because obviously there are roles in the literary industry that go far beyond those of us who can write. Is there a kind of vision to expand into that territory and kind of help people into the industry at every level?
Yeah, I think definitely it's something we have begun to think about more, because we realize that actually so much of the power in the literary industry is held not by writers, it's sort of held by publishers, agents, editors, for example, people who are running festivals and events. But it's an area that we don't think we necessarily right now have the resources to sort of actually actively tackle. Hopefully, maybe, as we become bigger, we can start to think about this, start to put more pressure on Scottish literary industry as a whole. I think we are starting to put that pressure, but again, our focus is still very much on writers and eliminating the sort of barriers that writers face when trying to, for example, get published or get a book deal. But it's something we are thinking about, and we're hopeful that more different organizations may sprout and sort of tackle those areas, and then one day we can sort of form a super organization,
So I can't remember the exact date, but you recently put out a call to action to the Scottish literary sector, and at the end of that call to action, you kind of directly ask for feedback and for input from these organizations. Have you had much of a response, and what's that response been so far?
Yeah, so the response has been really great so far, which is good, and we have had a few sort of very enthusiastic responses from various different agents in the literary sector. So publishers, for example, literary agencies, bookshops, festivals, and I guess this has been directly in response to the recent Black Lives Movement and the protests, Black Lives Matter protests. But I think we are sort of also aware that it's sort of not enough just to say you want to support things, and actually down the line, sometime there needs to be sort of more concrete sort of action and practices. And that is what we are trying to sort of hold accountable now going forward, is that although all these partners may say they want to support our cause, they want to, they're totally supportive, that actually change is much harder. And to ensure that this isn't just a sort of completely reactionary period, and that actually something long lasting and long term is created, something sustainable, we need to put different kinds of pressure on it. So to sum up, yes, it's been great, but I think me and others are taking it with a sort of cautious sort of approach until we see actually things starting to change.
And another thing you published recently that I know quite a lot of people who've read, I think it's gone around the industry in Scotland quite a lot, was your recent survey into the experience of BAME writers in Scotland. And it was a pretty harrowing account. Were you at all surprised by what came out of that survey?
I was not very surprised, I think, sadly. I think a lot of the things which came up in the survey, I think all of us sort of knew deep down, or had inklings about, or had experienced. You know, there were things such as maybe like 90% had never had a mentoring, had never had a writing mentor, which I think is very sad, actually, because a writing mentor can be so important. And there's various reasons why writers of color don't get writing mentors compared to sort of white writers. So as someone who also has grown up in Scotland, and I think, you know, has been involved in the Scottish literary scene, it's not surprising, but it's good to have a sort of this survey, these numbers as a sort of baseline. We were very keen to do the survey at the beginning of our project, at the beginning of the network, and to ensure that actually in a year or 2 years' time, we would do the survey again. And that is our plan, to do it again and see what, if anything, has changed. I think maybe there's more personal parts of the survey, with the questions about, you know, do you see yourself in these literary events that happens in Scotland, in these literary journals? And a lot of people said no, they don't see themselves. And I think that is sort of, you know, quite indicative of a number of various problems in the literary sector, but it's also just quite sad that actually, you know, you're picking up a journal and you don't see any writers of color in the journal, you don't see any narratives which speak to yourself, and that perpetuates then this sort of cycle of why writers of color feel excluded.
Yeah, and there's this kind of, specifically in Scotland, I think the survey, along with the, I don't know if you've read it, the report from Speak the Word,
Yes.
Rethinking Diversity in Publishing, it's kind of starting to challenge this narrative of Scottish exceptionalism and this idea that Scotland is somehow not as accountable as the rest of the UK for some of the for these imbalances, and they're not found up here. I think it's a fantastic kind of two-pronged attack that we've had from.
Because definitely, and it was quite coincidental that it came out roughly the same time, which was not planned. But you know, it was good that it was. And I think as a whole in Scotland, there's been increasing over the last few years, an increasingly public discourse around sort of our history, our legacy, especially to do with colonialism. And that discourse, although it has always been there, you know, it is being more talked about now, which I think can only be a good thing.
And so, going back to the findings of your survey, like, what was your personal response to reading that stuff, aside from thinking, okay, this is how this is going to impact the industry, but as a writer, how has that, and your other work with SBWN, how has that changed you as a writer?
Yeah, so I think, you know, going back to the survey, reading it, I was not surprised by the findings, by what other people were saying. You know, I of course was part of the survey. I inputted my sort of comments, but it was just, I guess, it wasn't shocking, but it was sad to see so many other writers sharing similar sentiments, like sharing, you know, that they experienced racism at sort of local Scottish events, readings, for example, and that to me, I guess, on a personal level, was what sort of struck me, that actually although the network is trying to change things at a larger scale, on a sort of larger level, that actually there's a sort of personal element which is so important, and you mustn't forget that actually these are people's lived experiences. And that goes back into why it's so important that we have this safer spaces policy, and why actually our workshops are so valued by myself and others, having that sort of opportunity to do the sort of never forget the sort of smaller stuff as we try to tackle the larger issues. And you asked me about how SBWN has sort of changed my own writing practice. I think perhaps a sort of cynical answer might be that SBWN takes up a lot of time. So actually I haven't had that much time to write. But I think that it's important to acknowledge that's a reality for a lot of writers who don't have the luxury of all that spare time to write. And especially writers who are involved in sort of activist, anti-racist, political sort of work, that it is demanding of time and labor. And that has to be respected, even if you're sacrificing, say, your own writing or craft. But the positive, I would say, one of, is that it's connected me to so many interesting writers and readers throughout Scotland as a whole, and that has enriched my work.
That's interesting. So, the kind of writers that you're targeting, how can they access your resources aside from just giving the website? How can they find you?
Yeah, so I think we are still quite a small organization, a new organization. And recently we were talking to people who had never heard about it until recently. And we as a team were trying to think of sort of why that may be. And we're aware that, we started off in a place which was maybe aligned to, say, a university, and now it's not, but, those networks need to be improved upon going forward as we finish our sort of first pilot year and hopefully get funding for the next few years to come. To get in touch to the resources, I would say that we're probably most prominent on social media these days. So that's not only Twitter, but we have a very active Facebook group for writers of color, where we post opportunities and share. We also now have a newsletter, which we sort of send out monthly, which has a sort of summary of our events and various sort of submission opportunities we found. And I guess just, as we begin to collaborate more and more with different organizations, just to sort of start, hopefully people will start to see us in different places, if that makes sense. Because we are planning to do some very exciting partnerships with different organizations. Fantastic.
So just to go back again to your call to action, for those who haven't read it, there's a line in it that I thought was very erudite, where you say inclusion is not a diversity subtask. Mm-hmm. Now, this is something that came up in Annemiek Sahar and Sharon Van Lente's report as well. Yes. What is it you're recommending that organizations do to go to this next step of increasing diversity and moving away from this kind of tick box culture of? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think what we want to do is, what we hope to do is to get organizations to, like you said, move away from just viewing writers of color as some sort of footnote that needs to be done, that needs to be finished and completed, ticked off, as it were, and to start to think about how actually their various practices and structures have in the past erased us or obscured us or stopped us from being part of that organization. I think that fundamentally is what we mean when we say inclusion is not just enough. Actually, this sort of systemic change needs to happen from within various organizations. And you have to question yourself, why do you have no Black editors in your large publishing team? Or why do you not have any writers of color in your board of trustees or, you know, whatever. And it's those questions which are hardest, I think, to sort of tackle, and it's the most difficult for organizations to admit to, I guess, also, because it fundamentally involves a redistribution of power, of serious power. You know, writers actually maybe on the whole don't have that much power. And so just having, say, oh, we have 5 writers in this magazine issue is really not enough. You know, and to go beyond that is something that we're trying to do, which we are trying to do mostly through, I guess, putting just pressure, continuously being in dialogue with these literary arts organizations, and sort of drawing attention to the fact that they could be doing more.
And yeah, you end your call to action in it with a great statement of saying, if you can't find a way to restructure this in your organization, you need to tear it apart and rebuild it, because it's not, you know, there's no way of pasting this onto the outside of an existing structure.
Yeah, and I think, you know, definitely it's, you know, although some people may think that's sort of a bit of hyperbole, you know, I think it's important to realize the limitations of any organization, and we certainly realize the limitations of our own. It's something we're sort of continuously trying to tackle, you know, day to day. And I think especially lots of very mainstream and old organizations definitely need to sort of rethink how they work, how they function for our sort of contemporary day and age. You know, I think that kind of work needs to be sort of prioritized.
Brilliant. Well, Jay, we are at our heart a publishing festival, so I just wanted to ask, are there any presses that you're reading at the moment that you can recommend?
Yeah, I would say I love independent presses. I think they are brilliant, and I always go out of my way to support them. Starting local, I think I love Charcoal Press, which I know is also on your festival. I think they do a brilliant job at promoting literature and translation, which is an area of interest, special interest to myself. And I think, plus Charcoal, I'm going to give another shout out to Tilted Access Press, who is also on this festival. They are brilliant. They do translation from Asian languages and countries. And I think the books they produce are just really interesting, and there's not much like them in the world. I'm a really big fan of Fitzcarraldo, based in London, who do these beautiful books. They do publish English language books, but actually I really love their translation. They recently published a book by a Palestinian writer called Adnia Shibli called Minor Details, which was brilliant. And yeah, everything they publish, I'm just very excited about.
Fitzcarraldo are wonderful. So the last thing, we talked at the beginning about what this first year of SBWN has been. What do you see coming in the next year, in the next few years?
Yeah, I think, you know, we are in the process of applying for funding for the next couple of years, and we're assuming that we do get funding, which we hope. We really want to sort of, I guess, get the time to work on projects which we haven't been able to do so far. So primarily, for example, we'd love to create a sort of mentoring scheme, a sort of really useful one that sort of puts writers in touch with other more established writers, or even people in the literary publishing industry. I think we'd want to sort of be able to strengthen our connections to editors, literary agents, that side of things, over the next few years, and provide a sort of that kind of resource to our writers who may be beginning to think about publishing their books, you know, beyond just the writing stage. And I think down the line, we'd love to, you know, focus again on, you know, publishing pamphlets or anthologies or sort of books from our members. That kind of material sort of output would be great. Yeah. So lots of exciting things planned. But yeah,
That's brilliant. Thank you so much for joining me, Jay. Anyone who's listening who is an aspiring writer, I really recommend you visit the Scottish BAME Writers Network.org and get involved with what they're doing, because it's really exciting, and I can kind of already perceive the waves going right across the industry in Scotland, which is incredibly exciting. There'll be links in the bio of Publicate where you can find links to their Twitter and to their website. So thank you so much, Jay. It's been a real pleasure having you.
Thank you so much, Joe. I'm delighted to have been part of this festival. Good luck for the rest of it. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.